King Charles had built his early reign around a principle, not just a public commitment to accountability or a strategic repositioning of the monarchy's image. A genuine working principle that he had apparently decided was the only viable foundation for an institution he had waited decades to lay. The principle was simple to state and very difficult to sustain. Nobody is above the consequences of their own choices, not the public. Not politicians, and not members of his own family. The willingness to apply that principle to his own brother, to formally strip Andrew of his titles, to require his departure from Royal Lodge, to decline private meetings, to manage the public distance while privately maintaining whatever version of the fraternal bond the situation could still accommodate, had been the most personally costly expression of that principle. It had not been effortless. It had been, by multiple accounts, genuinely painful, but it had been done. And then came the sightings. A source familiar with the situation described running into both Sarah Ferguson and Andrew Mountbatten Windsor together at an M6 motorway service station just a few weeks ago. Not at a family gathering or a managed occasion where their continued connection would be expected and choreographed, a petrol station on a motorway. Together, in circumstances that suggested she was considerably more present in Britain and considerably more in Andrew's orbit than the institutional arrangement was supposed to permit. The source was direct about it. She had been assumed to be in hiding but was apparently operating in somewhat plain sight. For Charles, that sighting, and everything it represents about the degree to which the institutional management of the York situation has succeeded in actually producing the separation it was designed to create, is the specific form in which the frustration that people around him describe as building to a point of genuine fury is taking shape. Not the original decisions. Those were made and they were painful, and Charles made them anyway because the principle required it. The fury is about the discovery that the decisions, however painful to make, have not produced the clean outcome they were supposed to produce. That two people who were supposed to be in managed retreat are still managing their own version of proximity. That the line in the sand keeps getting redrawn around where they actually are rather than where the institution needs them to be. The rumors about how exactly that continued proximity is being maintained have been extensive and have varied considerably in their credibility. Some claims circulating in the more sensationalized corners of the coverage have described elaborate scenarios involving Sarah being transporting inside moving vehicles, crouching out of sight to avoid security checkpoints, engaging in what one account described as something resembling a Cold War-style covert operation to breach the Sandringham perimeter. These accounts should be treated with skepticism. They have the quality of tabloid embellishment rather than credible intelligence, and the specific operational details they describe, hiding in footwells, being ferried in furniture trucks, sound considerably more dramatic than anything the available evidence supports. What the evidence does support is the simpler, and in some ways more genuinely alarming reality. Two people who have known each other for 40 years, who raised children together, who shared a home for nearly 2 decades after their divorce, who are both now navigating serious and overlapping crises without any obvious alternative source of the specific kind of support they provide each other, those two people have been continuing to maintain contact. And that contact has continued despite the institutional preference for a cleaner separation. The human reality of the connection is proving more persistent than the institutional management of the situation can entirely contain. The character of that persistence is what concerns Charles most. Not the sentimentality of it. He understands the sentimentality. He has lived inside the specific pull of the fraternal bond for his entire life, and the effort required to maintain institutional distance from a brother he grew up alongside has not been invisible to the people watching him manage it. What concerns him is the strategic dimension. Because the bond between Andrew and Sarah is not simply the residue of old affection, however real that affection is. It is something more structurally specific. A royal biographer who has studied the York family in detail has described the relationship with a precision that is useful here. Her continued proximity to Andrew served her commercially for years, keeping her inside the family circle in ways that were useful for her business dealings, providing continued access and association with the royal world at a time when her formal connection to it had been severed. His name opened doors that her name alone, increasingly complicated by scandal, had become less reliable at opening. They had separate wings. Their own lives, their own social worlds, their own private relationships across the period of the post-divorce cohabitation. The nannies and the security staff did much of the actual parenting while he traveled, and she spent extended periods in America building the commercial relationships that kept them financially afloat. The reality of the arrangement was considerably less cozy than the happily divorced couple framing implied. But it persisted because it served both of them. And the specific form of loyalty that had developed between them, not romantic loyalty in the conventional sense, but something more practical and more durable, the loyalty of two people who have faced catastrophes together and have learned that the other person will not disappear when things become difficult, proved resilient enough to survive everything the institution has tried to impose on it. Now, in 2026, both of them are facing the most acute version of the catastrophes that have defined their public lives. Andrew is in Marsh Farm under criminal investigation, with the specific allegation about passing confidential government information to Epstein sitting in the background of everything else that has accumulated against his name. Sarah is moving between wealthy friends across multiple countries, appearing occasionally in Britain, managing the fallout from her dissolved businesses and her closed charity, and the congressional request for testimony that has received no public response. Both of them are more isolated from their usual sources of institutional protection than at any previous point in their lives. And into that mutual isolation, the continued contact, the M6 service station sighting, the reports of her presence near the Sandringham estate, the evidence that the geographic separation the institution preferred has not been fully realized, makes a specific kind of sense. Not as a covert operation, not as a conspiracy of concealment. As two people whose lives have been entangled for 40 years reaching for each other in the way that people reach for the person who has survived the most with them when everything else becomes impossible to navigate alone. But sources close to people observing the situation have described a dimension of the relationship that goes beyond emotional support into something that carries more institutional weight. The claim, circulating in various forms, is that both Andrew and Sarah understand that they know things about the shared history of their lives, their associations, their finances, and their relationship with the palace over decades that neither of them has made fully public. The Epstein emails that have been released represent only a portion of the documented communication that existed between them and the figures at the center of the scandal. What remains sealed, what the full documentary record of their lives contains, is not fully known outside the investigators examining it. This creates the dynamic that a royal biographer described with notable directness: she could be dangerous to them. If pushed far enough, if the financial desperation becomes acute enough, or if the institutional abandonment feels complete enough, there is material available to her, stories about the family, about relationships, about the internal reality of life adjacent to the monarchy across the years she was part of it, that could be deployed in ways that would create considerable difficulty for the institution. Whether she would ever actually deploy it is a different question. But the possibility that she might is part of what makes the management of her situation so delicate for the palace. You do not want to push someone with that much first-hand knowledge of your most sensitive history into a corner from which the only exit looks like going public with everything they know. Charles is caught in the specific version of this dilemma that his position as king makes most acute. He is not simply a brother managing a difficult sibling. He is the monarch of an institution that Sarah Ferguson, if pushed hard enough, could materially damage. The policy of managed distance, not cutting her off entirely, not providing the kind of institutional support that would signal continued royal endorsement, but not pressing so hard that the corner becomes the only available space, is the specific balance that his position requires him to maintain. And the evidence that the balance is not producing the clean separation the institution wanted is the source of the frustration that people around him describe. William's response to the evidence has been considerably more categorical. He has watched the Andrew situation develop for years with a clarity that is sharpened by the knowledge that the institution he will inherit is the one that has to answer for it. His position, as reported by people close to his thinking, is that the continued proximity of Andrew and Sarah to each other and to the Sandringham estate represents an ongoing risk that the institutional management has not been sufficient to address. Two people who are supposed to be in managed retreat, who the institution has invested considerable effort in positioning as separate from the working monarchy's daily life, continuing to operate in ways that periodically require the institution to respond to their continued presence in its geography, that pattern, in William's assessment, signals that something more decisive is needed. For William, this is not primarily a personal grievance. He is exercised about what the pattern represents and what it signals about the degree to which the institutional decisions made about the York situation are being respected by the people those decisions were made about. If Andrew and Sarah continue to operate according to their own logic rather than the institution's preferred framework, the narrative of the York chapter being closed and the institution moving on is a narrative that keeps being contradicted by reality. Kate's position is equally firm, though coming from a slightly different angle. The concern attributed to her is generational rather than purely institutional. The pattern of secrecy and the habit of operating around the edges of formal rules rather than within them is the specific quality that, in her assessment, risks becoming the frame through which the York family is understood when history eventually writes the chapter. For the children she is raising, the ones who will carry the weight of the crown in a form shaped by everything happening now, the presence of an ongoing York situation that refuses to resolve cleanly is a complication that compounds with time. Prince Edward's reported role as a messenger, sent to convey to Andrew at Wood Farm that his days in that property were finished and that the king's tolerance had reached its limit, fits the pattern of how the family handles its most difficult internal communications. Not through official channels or formal letters creating a public record. Through a personal emissary. A sibling close enough to the principals to be heard, far enough from the center of institutional decision-making to function as a human messenger rather than a royal representative. Edward is the right person for exactly that kind of message. The larger question sitting beneath all the specific details, where Sarah has been how the continued proximity is being maintained, what William's position on the pattern is what the Andrew and Sarah situation ultimately represents for the institution that Charles is leading and William is preparing to inherit. There are two ways to read it. The first is that two deeply compromised people who have always operated according to their own logic are simply continuing to do what they have always done, and that the institution's frustration is the predictable consequence of having managed a situation through accommodation rather than resolution for too long. The second is that the bond between them carries risks that go beyond ordinary reputational damage. Two people who know this much about this family's most sensitive history, maintaining close contact in the middle of multiple overlapping investigations, is a situation that the institution cannot manage cleanly from the outside. Both readings have merit. The tension between them, between the human reality of two people who cannot fully separate themselves from a 40-year connection, and the institutional reality of a monarchy trying to close a chapter the principals refuse to close, is the specific form the Andrew and Sarah situation has taken in 2026. Charles drew his lines. He stripped the titles. He managed the distance. He absorbed the personal cost of enforcing the principle he had built his early reign around. And then two people were spotted together at a petrol station on the M6, and the lines turned out to be drawn in sand. That is the fury. Not that the original decisions were wrong. They were the right decisions, made at real personal cost, applied as consistently as the combination of institutional requirement and fraternal loyalty allowed. The fury is that the decisions, even correctly made and consistently applied, have not been sufficient to produce the clean chapter ending that the institution needs. The sand keeps shifting. The line keeps requiring redrawing. And the people the line was drawn around keep finding each other on motorways and in ways that the palace's carefully managed narrative of concluded chapters cannot easily accommodate. The chapter is not closed. The line has been drawn again. And Charles, as both king and brother, is managing the fury that comes with discovering that some situations cannot be resolved by any decision, however right and however costly, made from the outside of a 40-year bond that has not yet decided to end.